Sailors have a word for the place where the ocean swallows you whole and never gives you back. They call it Davy Jones's Locker. For 300 years, that name has haunted every man who ever set foot on a wooden deck and stared into open water. But nobody really knows where it came from. Nobody knows who Davy Jones actually was. And that mystery, that deep, unsettling gap in history, might be the most terrifying thing about it. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. To understand why Davy Jones's Locker became the most feared phrase in all of maritime history, you have to understand what the sea actually was to the people who sailed it in the 1600s and 1700s. It was not a vacation. It was not a shipping lane. It was a monster, a living, breathing force that could decide completely on its own whether you lived or died. Storms appeared without warning. Reefs lurked beneath the surface like teeth. Ships caught fire. Ships capsized. Ships simply vanished, leaving nothing behind but a few floating planks and an entry in a port ledger that no one would ever cross off. The men who sailed those ships were not adventurers in the romantic sense. Most were desperate. Merchant sailors pressed into service, poor boys from coastal towns with no other option. Criminals who signed on to avoid worse fates on land. They lived below deck in spaces so cramped and so dark that standing upright was a privilege. They ate salt preserved meat that rotted slowly. They drank water that went green and foul within weeks at sea. They died of scurvy, which causes your gums to bleed and your teeth to fall out while your old wounds reopen from the inside. They died of dysentery. They died of infections from injuries so minor that on land you would have walked them off. And when they died at sea, there was no burial. There was no grave. There was no headstone. Their bodies were wrapped in canvas and dropped overboard. The ocean took them. Whatever was left of them sank into darkness, into cold, into crushing pressure, into a depth so complete that light itself could not follow. That was where they went. That was the locker. And slowly, over decades of shared terror and storytelling on those ships, that place acquired a name and a keeper. The first written appearance of Davy Jones comes from a man named Tobias Smollett. In 1751, Smollett published a novel called The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, and in that book he wrote about Davy Jones as though the character already needed no introduction. He described him as a fiend who presided over all the evil spirits of the deep and who appeared to sailors as an omen of doom. Smollett did not create Davy Jones. He recorded a legend that was already old, already feared, already told in the dark below decks when the ship groaned against the waves and men stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about what was underneath them. But where did the name come from? That is where the mystery gets strange. There is no historical Davy Jones whose biography you can trace. There is no grave, no trial record, no ship manifest with that name attached to a story that cleanly explains the legend. What there are instead are theories, several of them, each one pulled from a different corner of maritime history, each one plausible in its own way, and none of them proven. The first theory centers on a real man who may have been one of the most notorious pub owners in the history of London. Some historians have suggested that there was a tavern keeper in the early 1600s named David Jones who ran a notorious establishment near the Thames. This man supposedly had a habit of robbing sailors. He would get them drunk, lock them in a storage locker at the back of his tavern, and then sell them to press gangs. Press gangs were groups of men authorized by the British Royal Navy to forcibly conscript sailors. If you got press ganged, you woke up on a naval vessel, already at sea, with no way home. You were a sailor now, whether you wanted to be or not. Being put in Davy Jones's locker, in this version of the story, meant being locked away by that pub keeper until you could be handed over to a fate worse than death. The sea would take you either way. It is a compelling story. It has the texture of something real. But no one has produced a document or court record that proves this David Jones existed. The theory floats on its own plausibility, which in matters of legend is often enough. The second theory takes a different approach entirely. It reaches back not to London, but to the Bible, and to a figure whose name sounds like Davy Jones if you say it in the right accent after a few decades of oral transmission. That figure is Jonah. The biblical prophet Jonah, who disobeyed God, was thrown overboard by sailors trying to calm a storm, swallowed by a great fish, and spent 3 days in its belly before being spat back out onto shore. In Hebrew, his name is Yonah. In the Welsh language, which has its own long tradition of seafaring, Jonah becomes Jones. And over centuries of retelling, as the story traveled from religious texts into the mouths of sailors on British ships, Jonah the prophet became Jones, the devil of the deep. The Davy attached to it may simply be a generic sailor's name, the same way Jack was used for any ordinary seaman in British naval slang. This theory has serious academic support. The connection between Jonah and maritime superstition runs deep. Sailors for centuries considered it bad luck to have a Jonah on board, meaning a person who brought misfortune. The word Jonah became synonymous with cursed, with doomed, with the kind of person whose bad luck was contagious. Translating that into Davy Jones as the spirit of the sea's judgment feels like a natural progression. You are not just cursed. You are delivered to the thing that swallowed Jonah. You go into the belly of the deep, and unlike Jonah, you do not come back. The third theory is the darkest one. It involves a real historical figure, though the evidence connecting him to the legend is circumstantial rather than definitive. His name was Dafydd ap Gruffudd, a Welsh sailor and pirate who operated in the Caribbean in the mid-1600s. He was known for extraordinary cruelty, even by the standards of an era in which cruelty was essentially the baseline. He tortured prisoners. He murdered crews rather than take them captive. He sank ships not for their cargo, but apparently for the pleasure of watching them go down. He was eventually hanged, but the stories about him did not die with him. They spread, they circulated, they grew. And as they grew, Dafydd, a name that in Welsh is pronounced roughly as Davy, attached itself to the mythology of the sea's judgment. If any man deserved to sit at the bottom of the ocean counting the dead, it was someone like him. None of these theories cancel each other out. Legends rarely have clean single origins. They accrete like coral, a little from one source, a little from another, compressed by time and repetition into something that feels ancient and inevitable, even if it was assembled from pieces. Davy Jones's locker is almost certainly a composite. A biblical name, a criminal's reputation, a Welsh sailor's infamy, and the generic dread of men who spent their lives above something they could not see the bottom of, all of it given a face and a title and a home address at the deepest point of the ocean. What is not in dispute is the function that Davy Jones served. He was the answer to the question that no sailor could afford to ask out loud, but that every sailor carried. What happens to you when the sea takes you? The Christian answer, resurrection and paradise, required a body, a burial, a proper ceremony. The sea denied all of that. You did not get a grave. You did not get last rites. You just went down. And in the folklore of men who lived with that reality every day, it made psychological sense to give the bottom of the ocean a ruler, a custodian. A figure who was responsible for keeping what the sea had taken. By the 1700s, the legend had fully matured. Sailors described Davy Jones as a creature, not quite human, who appeared before ships about to be lost. He had, in various accounts, 3 rows of teeth. He had blue smoke from his nostrils. His eyes were described as fiery, which is a strange image for a figure associated with water, but which may reflect an older tradition of sea demons drawn from Norse mythology, where the boundary between the underworld's fire and the sea's cold was not always clear. He appeared on the rigging of doomed ships. He sat on the horizon at night. He was the last thing men saw before a wave took them. The phrase Davy Jones's locker itself referred specifically to the bottom of the sea, but it carried an additional meaning. A locker on a ship was a storage chest. It was where you kept your belongings, your personal effects, the small things that made you an individual rather than just a body on a vessel. To go to Davy Jones's locker was to have your entire existence, everything you were, everything you owned, committed to the possession of something that would never give it back. It was death rendered as property transfer. The sea owned you now. This concept had particular power in an era when sailors had almost nothing to begin with. A man who sailed on a merchant vessel in 1700 might own the clothes on his back, a hammock, a knife, and a Bible if he could read. Those things, modest as they were his. They were proof he had lived. Davy Jones took all of it. The locker was not just where your body went, it was where your identity went, where the evidence that you had ever existed dissolved into salt and pressure and time. The golden age of piracy, running roughly from the 1680s through the 1730s, gave the Davy Jones legend new fuel. Pirates were a specific kind of seaman. They had rejected the legitimate maritime world, which was itself already brutal, and had constructed their own codes, their own hierarchies, their own relationship with death. Pirate crews were more democratic than naval crews. They elected their captains. They divided prizes according to written contracts. They took votes. But they also understood that their profession had one guaranteed end, and that end was violent. Pirates hanged. That was the standard outcome. The British Royal Navy pursued them. Colonial governors put bounties on them. The law was absolute about it. If you were taken alive, you hanged. If you died in battle, you went to Davy Jones. Those were the options, and in that binary, the locker became something almost preferable. At least the sea did not put you on display. At least you did not dangle from a gibbet cage at the entrance to a harbor for years, your body drying in the wind, a warning to other men who might consider your profession. Men like Blackbeard, whose real name was Edward Teach, operated within this framework. Blackbeard was active between 1716 and 1718, terrorizing the Atlantic coast and the Caribbean with a fleet that at its peak included 4 vessels and nearly 400 men. He cultivated his own mythology deliberately. He put slow-burning fuses in his beard and hat so that he appeared to emerge from smoke in battle. He was enormous, physically intimidating, and apparently genuinely fearless in a way that his crew found both inspiring and disturbing. When he died in November 1718, killed in hand-to-hand combat by a British naval lieutenant named Robert Maynard off the coast of North Carolina, it reportedly took 5 gunshot wounds and 20 sword cuts to finish him. His head was removed and hung from Maynard's bowsprit as proof. The story circulated afterward that Blackbeard's headless body swam circles around the ship before finally sinking. This is obviously not true, but its persistence says something important about how the Davy Jones mythology interacted with real historical figures. Death was not sufficient for men like Blackbeard. The locker had to reach up for him personally. Ordinary burial was for ordinary men. Calico Jack, whose real name was John Rackham, died in 1720 and became famous not for his own deeds, but for the women who sailed with him. Anne Bonny and Mary Red were both members of his crew. Both fought when his other crew members were too drunk to stand, and both were captured, along with him, off the coast of Jamaica. Rackham hanged. His body was placed in a gibbet. Anne Bonny's reported last words to him were that if he had fought like a man, he would not be hanged like a dog. The sea had not taken Calico Jack. Davy Jones had been cheated of him, and in the logic of maritime superstition, that was its own kind of curse. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, was arguably the most successful pirate of the Golden Age. He captured over 400 ships between 1719 and 1722. He did not drink, which made him unusual among pirates. He ran a disciplined ship with a code covering gambling, lights-out times, and the treatment of captive women. He was killed in February 1722 when a grape-shot blast hit him in the throat. His crew, following his instructions, immediately threw his body overboard. They gave him to the locker deliberately because he understood that his body on display would be used as propaganda, and because the ocean was a more appropriate resting place for a man who had lived his entire adult life on it. The Davy Jones mythology was not only British. It moved with the sea trade, and the sea trade moved everywhere. Portuguese sailors had their own version, a figure called the Enchanted Moor, who collected the drowned. Spanish sailors spoke of the Marinero de las Profundidades, the sailor of the depths, who kept a record of every man who had gone overboard. Scandinavian tradition contributed Ran, a goddess of the sea who used a net to drag sailors down and collect them in her hall beneath the waves, a concept almost structurally identical to Davy Jones. These parallel legends did not originate from each other, but they reinforced each other when their cultures met on the water. Every seafaring people had independently arrived at the same conclusion. The deep had a keeper. The dead had a lord. What made the British version dominant was partly the dominance of the British Royal Navy and British merchant shipping in the 18th and 19th centuries, and partly the literature. Tobias Smollett introduced Davy Jones to literate audiences in 1751, and from that point forward the legend had a paper trail. It appeared in Frederick Marryat's naval novels in the 1830s. It appeared in Washington Irving's Writing in America. It appeared in travel memoirs, in ship logs where sailors recorded their superstitions alongside their weather observations, and eventually in the popular press as maritime adventure became a genre that middle-class readers could consume from the safety of their parlors. The submarine cable-laying era of the mid-1800s added a new dimension to the mythology. When engineers began sending ships out to lay telegraph cables along the ocean floor, they brought up physical samples of what was down there. Sediment, tiny organisms, the actual texture of the deep. And what they found was so alien, so unlike anything on the surface world, that it confirmed every instinct sailors had ever had about the bottom of the ocean being a different kind of place. It was cold in a way that had no seasonal variation. It was dark absolutely, completely, permanently. The creatures that lived there were adapted to a world without light and were consequently the stuff of nightmares. Anglerfish with their bioluminescent lures, gulper eels with mouths that opened to half their body length, giant squid whose existence, though reported by sailors for centuries, was not confirmed by science until the late 1800s. The giant squid in particular did enormous work for the Davy Jones mythology. Sailors had been reporting encounters with enormous tentacled creatures for as long as there had been sailors. The Norse called it the Kraken. Mediterranean sailors called it the Polypo. It appeared in the mythology of virtually every coastal culture, with enough boat-building capacity to get into deep water. And science's eventual confirmation that yes, giant cephalopods do exist, and yes, they do reach lengths of up to 40 feet, felt less like a discovery and more like a confirmation. The deep was exactly as dangerous as sailors had always said. Davy Jones had staff. The mythology evolved through the 19th century in ways that reflected the changing nature of maritime culture. As steam replaced sail and navigation became more precise, the immediate terror of the sea diminished somewhat. You were less likely to vanish without trace. You had engines, you had charts, you had increasingly accurate weather forecasting. But the locker remained. It adapted. In the age of steam, Davy Jones became less a figure of supernatural dread and more a cultural touchstone, a reference point for the sea's ultimate authority over human ambition. You could build a better ship. You could hire a better captain. You could plot a more careful course. But the locker was still there. The sea had not agreed to any of your improvements. The RMS Titanic which sank in April 1912, was in many ways the final definitive statement of that point. The Titanic was the largest ship ever built at the time. It had watertight compartments. It had the best engines available. It was carrying the wealthiest people in the world, people for whom the entire concept of helplessness was foreign. And it sank in under 3 hours. 1,500 people went into the North Atlantic. Their bodies, those that were recovered, were brought back to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Many were not recovered. Many went to the bottom. Many went, in the idiom that every sailor in every port understood, to Davy Jones. The wreck of the Titanic sits at a depth of approximately 12,500 feet, which means it is in the part of the ocean called the abyssal zone. No light reaches it. The water temperature is just above freezing. The pressure at that depth is roughly 375 times the atmospheric pressure at sea level. The hull has been slowly consumed by bacteria, and by the mid-2030s, it is expected to have collapsed entirely. Whatever remains of the people who went down with it has long since become part of the sediment. The locker does not give back what it takes. The phrase itself has never gone out of use. It passed from maritime slang into the general language in the 18th century, and it has stayed there ever since. When Robert Louis Stevenson wrote Treasure Island in 1883, his pirates swore by Davy Jones and threatened enemies with the locker. When cinema arrived, the image traveled with it. Davy Jones appeared in film and television as a figure ranging from genuinely menacing to comic, but always recognizable, always carrying the same essential meaning: the deep, the permanent, the place you go when the sea decides it is done with you. The Pirates of the Caribbean film franchise, beginning in 2003, gave Davy Jones a specific face and a specific story for a new generation. The version played by Bill Nighy, all tentacles and barnacles, and a pipe organ built into his ship, is not historically accurate to anything. But its emotional logic is sound. It portrays Davy Jones as a figure of grief as much as cruelty, a man who once had human feelings and chose to lock them away, to commit them to his own chest at the bottom of the sea, and in doing so, became monstrous. That reading of the legend, Davy Jones as a figure of self-inflicted damnation rather than external malevolence, is actually one of the more philosophically interesting interpretations the mythology has ever received. Because the oldest versions of the legend do carry that ambiguity. Davy Jones is not simply evil. He is the sea's accountant. He keeps what the sea takes. He does not choose who comes to him. The sea chooses. He simply maintains the collection. And in that passivity, there is something almost tragic. He did not ask to be the keeper of the drowned. He simply is. The real power of the Davy Jones legend is that it gives form to formlessness. Death at sea was the most anonymous death available to a human being in the age of sail. You left no body. You left no grave. Your name might appear in a ship's log, and if the ship itself survived, someone might eventually read that log and know you had existed. But the sea gave no monument. The sea offered nothing to the people you left behind who needed a place to grieve. Davy Jones gave the dead an address. He made the bottom of the ocean a place rather than just a condition. He turned disappearance into destination. That is why sailors told and retold his story across 3 centuries and across every ocean. Not because they believed literally that a creature with 3 rows of teeth and smoke coming from his nostrils sat at the bottom of the sea counting bodies, but because the alternative was that the men who went overboard simply stopped existing, and that particular truth was too cold even for men who lived their whole lives in the cold. The legend of Davy Jones is not a ghost story. It is a coping mechanism. It is the human mind refusing, in its stubbornness and its creativity, to accept that death at sea meant nothing. If the sea took you, something received you, something kept you. And however dark and however final that something was, at least it had a name. That name has lasted 300 years and shows no sign of fading. As long as ships go out and the ocean reminds us that it was here long before we were, and we'll be here long after. Davy Jones will be waiting. The locker will be open. And somewhere at the bottom of things, in the cold and the dark and the silence, the collection grows. So there it is. 3 centuries of maritime dread compressed into one name. From a Welsh pirate, a biblical prophet, a London pubkeeper, and the collective terror of every man who watched the horizon and wondered what lived beneath it. Davy Jones's locker is not just a legend. It is the sea's most honest truth. It takes everything, keeps everything, and answers to no one. If you found this story haunting, hit subscribe and let the next one pull you under.